Hey guys, Darren back again. Today we're looking at the PC Engine Duo R and we're going to install the RGB amp that's out there. There's a few versions of this amp, but we're going to install it and hopefully get a nice clean RGB signal from it and go from there. So it involves a new DIN connector on the back, it involves a SCART cable and a few little tweaks here and there. So let's run through it. So a friend of mine owns this console and he sent it in for modding. So first thing we need to do is pull it apart. So you just flip the old guy over and take out 5 or so screws. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 down here. So these screws down here are actually a Torx 10. This one's already half out. It's actually a Torx 10. It fits in perfectly. However, if you look closely at the screw head, it's actually got a raised part in the center, and that prevents the Torx 10 piece, the tip, going down far enough. You probably need to actually buy these with a recessed center, so it'll actually fit in. But if you're like me, you can just sort of get around that by using a flat blade screwdriver that'll actually just fit down the side of the screw head. And if you're careful enough, they'll come right out, so they will actually unscrew. I'll just do one here that I haven't touched yet. So you put it sort of down the side like that. And very gently with the right sort of pressure, you'll be able to turn that and get the screw out without damaging it. So don't use too much force because it'll strip and it'll move around in the screw head. But if you're careful, that will just come right out. So with the console flipped back up the right way, we can gently lift the lid and turn it to the right. And you'll notice that it's attached to the motherboard with this red connector here. So just gently pull that out and the lid should be free, which we can put off to the side. Then we're left with the motherboard and the optical drive assembly, which we're not going to use today. So let's get that out of the way. It is sort of in the way of what we're aiming to do. So there's a couple of connectors, 1, 2, 3. There might be another one, but let's just take these 3 out to begin with. So just gently pull these out. They are color coded, so you can't get them too wrong when you put them back. Just be careful not to break any wires, and there you go. So basically just the black with the red and the white, they'll just come right out. Then gently pick up the optical drive and that all lifts right out. So I'll just put that aside in a position where I'm not going to bump that and touch it, and we'll reinstall that later on. So this is our board. We've got a fuse down here on the side, so if you have power related issues, that's the first thing I'd be looking at. Check the fuse. Twin regulators, so they look like 7805s. I'm sure they are. I haven't had a good look at those yet. And the main NEC chip in the middle. I think we're going to mount our board around about there as well. So output that way, output to the connector, input will come off the pins, and we'll work out where to solder that in a second. But it's basically just a very simple RGB amp board like this. This one is PC Engine RGB Amp version 2.1. I'll post a link in the description of where you can actually buy this. It's based on the THS7374 amplifier. There's a few designs out there, but they're all basically the same. They all do similar things. So on the left we have our input, red, green, blue, 5 volts and ground. Very straightforward. And on the output we have red, green and blue. Now we don't have a sync output. I believe this board just uses the composite video as sync. We're going to basically mount the chip around about here. We're going to pull the motherboard out in a second. We're going to desolder the stock standard 5-pin DIN, which is not going to do RGB because it just doesn't have enough pins. We'll remove that. We'll modify that a little bit, and we'll modify the new one a little bit, and we'll put in this new 8-pin DIN, which will carry our RGB signals across the top here. So that all came in the kit. It seems pretty straightforward. I've actually never done one of these before, but we'll see how we go. It doesn't look too difficult, so let's crack on. So the very next thing we need to do is remove the motherboard completely. So, you know, this sort of stuff is common sense, but on this particular motherboard, it looks like we've got a screw up here. We've got one up the top here. We've got probably two on the side of the cart slot, and we've got one down there. I think that's going to be it. But if I miss one, no big deal. We'll just pull that out as well. So I'll just quickly back these screws out, and we'll be back in a second. Okay, so with those screws out, we should be able to lift this board out. I'm going to grab hold of it on the regulators and lift it up like that. So we've had the switch fall off, which is fine. That's just a plastic slider. I'll put that with the screws. Does this come off? No, that stays attached. That's fine. Let's just turn him upside down and have a look. Okay, so it's all pretty clean. I'm going to contact the customer again in a second and just check that he doesn't want to do all the capacitors while we're here, because I think these boards are notorious for bad caps, but I have tested this unit and it does work very well. It looks actually fantastic. So, and there is an absolute ton of capacitors on this board, so it's quite time consuming. So we'll just see what he wants to do about that. Okay, let's move the base out of the way. So the very next thing we need to do is desolder our 5-pin DIN. So I'm just going to flip this up this way. I'm going to turn on the desoldering gun, and we're going to aim to remove the solder points here so we can drop out that connector. So it's basically going to be these 2 points, and then these two, that one, and those two, the larger sort of ones in this area. And then the whole connector will drop out, and then we'll take a look at how to modify it. Okay, so I just went ahead and desoldered these points with my desoldering gun, just a very basic one. And they're all nice and clean, and the DIN connector just falls out basically. So that's good, nice and easy to work with. What we need to do next is put the 8-pin DIN in its place, but we're going to need to steal some parts off this one and just modify the new one a little bit. So if you compare them side by side, you'll see that the front has the two chassis pins in different places, so we can easily move those across. This whole plastic piece just lifts up and we can swap that out. And you'll also notice that the 3 rear pins, which is the RGB pins, are not present on that one, obviously. So we're going to actually cut these pins flush inside so they don't actually touch the board. There's no actual provision on the board for those pins anyway, so we want to solder to the back of them ultimately, so we don't want them to touch the board. So we'll trim that and we'll swap these base plates over. So to do that, this whole plastic piece just comes off, and all you need to do is get a small pair of pliers in there. That one's actually not the right size. I'll just use some tweezers. Lift up these side legs on both sides. You can probably just use your thumbnail. Like that. Okay, lift it up and slide the top piece completely out of the way. And the pins will all stay in place. However, the underneath one will sort of just lift out, and we're going to use that pin on the new piece. So we'll just put that down. We're sort of done with this original one now. So let's just take the back off this one, and I'll show you what I mean exactly. Just lift that up. Lift this side up. Like that. Very carefully slide that up. Now that one sort of came apart, which is fine. We don't need that. We're ultimately going to put this top piece onto that one, like that. But before we do it, the 3 rear RGB pins, so these 3 at the very back here, we need to just modify. So looking at the height of this when it's connected back in, they're all quite long, so we're going to need to cut them at probably, you know, just below the plastic sort of surface level. So something like that, just so they stay in place, but they don't touch the board. And then we can just solder to the back of these pins. So let me just get a cutting tool, like a side cutters, and I'll trim them off. Okay, so I've just snipped off that one right there, and you can see the sort of height that I left that at. It'll just clip into the plastic, but it won't protrude down into the board. So if we do a quick retest fit of just the basic part. Yeah. So that's how it's sort of going to end up, but this rear section is in the way, so we're going to cut some of that off as well, and that'll allow us to solder into the back of the pins. Now these, unfortunately, these DIN connectors, they're all a little bit different, so they generally work exactly the same way. In fact, they all work the same way, but the plastic molding and the way the pins are sort of held into place and that sort of stuff does vary. So you're going to sort of have to just see what yours is doing and modify it accordingly. So I don't think we need this whole rear panel, so I'm going to go ahead and basically chop that off, and that should allow us to access the pins. Mine had a large rectangle piece of plastic there, which you saw previously. I've cut the corners off, and I've sort of cut down the middle with a file and just my snips, so I'll be able to access the pins on the back basically when that's in place. And the very last thing we need to do is take the center pins from each of them and just work out which one we want to use on our new piece. So this is the 5 pin, which we won't need, but it came with the pins that are close together, and we need those two because they will fit into the board back in there. So they're the ones we're going with, and it turns out that these sort of plastic cases, even though they are all different, they still come provisioned with the holes in place. So it's just a matter of moving the pins across and then refitting the whole thing together. So we'll go like that, lock it in place, it all clips down. So now we get our 2 pins at the back, we get our regular 5 pins sticking up that way. That's going to fit onto the board perfectly, like that, no problem at all. But we've got 8 pins. Obviously the RGB pins don't come through, and we're just going to solder to those 3 pins at the back. So that's basically what you need to achieve, and you'll have to mix and match your parts to make that work because they are all a little bit different. Okay, so right now we can refit. So just sit it back on top, and we'll go ahead and solder those pins back together. So I won't show you all the soldering, it's just basically flux and solder, put it in place. So that's all back on. So it looks basically factory now, and that's going to poke out the rear with 8 pins instead of 5. So with that DIN connector in place, we're now ready to start wiring up our board. So we've simply got our inputs and our outputs. We've got red, green, blue source input, which is actually going to come off this Hudson C6260 chip in the middle, sort of down there. And we've got 5 volts and we've got ground. 5 volts will actually come off the main NEC chip on this most corner edge here, and ground will be on that corner. So I believe that's 60 and 61 actually, but basically N pin for ground and then this edge for 5 volts. And then if we just move up the board a little bit to this area, I've already started to tin these pins up. Just in the middle of this sort of pin, around the 50 pin marker on the board, we're going to take red, green and blue. So I'll also zoom in. I might put a graphic up on the screen of exactly where to take that. I'm just going to run our 3 wires from the RGB source to the board. Our power and ground will come off this chip here, and the whole chip will basically stick to the main NEC chip in the middle. It comes with a bit of adhesive tape, so that's perfect. And then obviously our 3 outputs RGB just go to our rear connector just there. So we'll solder onto the back of that. So that's the plan. I'll prepare the pins, I'll solder some wires into place and I'll show you how I've done it. Okay, so at this point I've got the basic wires in place, and I just wanted to pause here and show you what I've done. So as you can see, we have the RGB wires soldered up to the 6260 at the bottom there in that order. They run up to the board, which I've just stuck onto the main NEC chip here in the middle, and we're going to just solder them straight to the input pins on this edge here. I've just added a little bit of solder to that edge, which I'll for tinning, and I'll just place those wires on. And then of course our power and ground. The yellow is our 5-volt feed, and the black is our ground. They'll just run over here onto this edge, and this entire input side will be done, and then we focus over here onto the output. So I'll just tin these up, and I'll run wires to the RGB pins of the back connector. Now the order in which they run, it's actually red on the right, green in the middle, and blue on the left. Does that match our board? No, so we got red, green, blue, so we're gonna have to swap them over and you know, sort of twist the wires as they go, but that's no big deal. Red, green, blue, and then red, green, blue. So very simple. This particular mod just uses composite video as its sync source, and you need a correct cable to go with that, which I'll show you in a second. So I'll go ahead, I'll tin this up, I'll put these 3 final wires in place, I'll solder these ones in place, and I'll show you the finished result. Okay, so those wires are now soldered into place, and they just run up to the rear connector right there in that order. Red from the right, green in the middle, and blue on the end. Okay, so I've just popped in a Hue card, pitch this side facing up. It's okay that this is all loose, it's no problem. Let's power it up and we'll give you a look and see how it's all going. So, just power you up, lift you up past the... I've got a big microphone here in front of me in case you're wondering. And there we go. So it looks pretty good. I'm just going to reach over and push run. And there we go. I can't really control it with one hand, but yeah, you get the idea. Our colors are coming through pretty nice. Everything looks pretty good actually. I wonder if I can... I'll just turn that off and I'll turn it back on. Yeah, so, you know, we've got nice red, you know, we've got red up here, we've obviously got green coming through, and we've got nice blue. So 3 separate colors are coming through, and that's what you want to see. If it wasn't wired up correctly, you'd definitely get funny colors happening here, and probably the whole background would be a bit funny colored as well. So that's pretty good. That's the mod pretty much done, but I just want to do one more thing and try and fix these jailbars. So if you look really closely here on the background, you can see these vertical jailbars all the way along the video. I'll zoom that in for you. You can just see them faintly running through here. So we've got the capacitors needed, so we're just going to swap out a couple of caps and try and fix that. So yeah, I hope you can see that. I can see it definitely on the screen. So we'll put them in and we'll do a comparison before and after. Okay, so I've just switched the whole board upside down. So what we're looking at here is the Hue card slots about here, just to get your bearings. Now I've put 2 replacement capacitors just here on top. They're just in their plastic case still, but you can see how small they are. And the 2 we're looking to replace is C923, which I've put a bit of black texture around, and C909, just right there. So those 2. And the way to do this is to basically heat up your soldering iron, grab a bit of solder, use the face of the iron, just gonna clean that off, add a bit of solder, and sort of heat both sides at once. It doesn't matter what it looks like, and then just push the whole thing off. So you just sort of heat, add, push. The old component will end up on the iron. We don't need that. Basically throw that away. And we'll do the same with this one. Just be kind of careful with this one not to touch that resistor next to it. So There you go. That's all there is to that. Now, I'll put a bit of flux on this. I'll try and open these little tiny capacitors and put them into place. I don't know if I can film it. I'll try. I might do one and then the other. But the trick is just to basically use a pair of tweezers, hold the component in the right sort of spot. There's plenty of solder left on the board, so don't wick it, just leave it as it is. Touch one side, let it set, come back and do the other side, and you should be done. I'll give that a go now, and if I can film it I will, so just bear with me. Okay, so I got it out of the packet, which was actually a bit of a fiddle. It was so small. Now I'm just going to sit that sort of in place like that. Let's grab the soldering iron and we'll try and do this closer edge first. These can go either way. There's no problem with the orientation. Okay, so they're both in. Give you a bit of a zoom. So yeah, look, it's not the neatest job, but they're in and they're sitting pretty straight. So that's the job done. So let's now fire this back up and we'll see what difference it made. Okay, so I'm going to switch it back on. It's running through the OSSC, so it takes a couple of seconds for the image to come through HDMI, so don't worry about that. That delay is just my sort of upscaler. Okay, so here we go, and I think it looks pretty good. I think those lines are gone. There you go, so new caps, and we're good to go. I'm pleased with that. That's a very simple job. Well, a bit fiddly, but I'm just not used to working with surface mount very often. I stick to the old school through hole, but you know what, it's not really that hard. I would probably recommend a smaller soldering iron tip to make that job a bit easier, but you know what, it wasn't too bad. Alright guys, well let's I want to now wash up the case and start to reassemble. Okay, I'm putting it all back together. Don't forget to reconnect your top case lid switch back into that connector down there, and we should be right. So I'll put the lid back on and we'll give this a test. And of course the cables used today were from retrogamingcables.co.uk. This particular one is a pack-a-punch extra shielded cable for the PC Engine TurboGrafx 16, and it's wired for composite video as sync, not C-Sync. So that one suits the board that we've put in today. So looking in the actual head of the SCART, and it's just a straight through wiring. There is no passive capacitors or resistors, as all that is provided on the board itself, the RGB board that we install. So it's just a straight through wire, but very tidy, and really nice grounding on these ones. So the extra ground wire there, which runs right through, and you can see on the cable they label these ones pack-a-punch for the extra shielding, which is excellent. So that's where you go to get them, retrogamingcables.co.uk, and of course I'll post a link to that in the video description. Okay, so with the lid back on, I'm going to go ahead and test out a few more games, especially some CD-based games. I think the laser is actually pretty good in this one. I've tested it already with a genuine game and a burnt audio CD, and it plays fine. But I'm going to go ahead and make a game. I'm just going to get a ROM, burn it from one that I own, and test that out, and maybe adjust the laser and pots if necessary. But if I need to do that, I'll film it and I'll make another video, but I don't think I'm going to, because I think this is actually a pretty good console. So let's leave the video there. That's basically how to install the RGB amp. It's pretty straightforward and the results are quite amazing. So I'll give you a final screenshot of my screen, and that'll be it guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.